Okay, so if you could please take your seats, we're going to begin the second half of our program. Hope that everybody's having a good night tonight. We will have scoring updates provided by TV Tim Banal throughout the night. I think we've seen two great speakers tonight. I will make an announcement here. Lauren made an announcement. Next year, if you want to write these down, October 17th, which is a Saturday, we'll come back. 2009. Lauren will be back. He's going to be talking about The Abominable Snowman and the Adventures of Tom Slick. And Jeff Belanger will also be back. He'll be talking about whatever book he's working on. And I'm sure it'll be an entertaining show. So, okay. Next up, we're really lucky to have this guy here. When I usually do both ends of this conference, I do a UFO show the Friday night, and then Saturday we do the Monster Mash. And again, folks, if I could please have your attention, only because we can start the program. I don't mind if you mingle in the back, if you could just keep your voices down, but obviously you can't hear what I'm saying because you're talking to the dude next to you. Thank you. This guy, I brought him in because he is a prolific author. He's written a lot of books about UFOs. Had a wonderful speech last night that you missed on Men in Black, but we will put it up on YouTube. But tonight, he's a world-renowned monster hunter who has traveled to several continents in search of bizarre creatures like the chupacabra, the Mongolian deathworm, Bigfoot, owlman, giant reptiles, and other assorted mysterious creatures. He's a charter member of the Fortean Center for Cryptozoology, and his books include Monster Hunter, There's Something in the Woods, Three Men Seeking Monsters, and tonight's lecture, Man Monkey in Search of the British Bigfoot. Folks, please welcome from Birmingham, England, via Dallas, Texas, Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thanks, everybody. I'm not sure I can follow John's scary English accent, but I'll try. that was scary, John. But yeah, as John just said, what I'm going to speak about tonight is reports of Bigfoot in Britain. And I suppose that, you know, for a country like Britain, when you talk about Bigfoot, you don't necessarily associate the two together. You know, when we talk about Sasquatch, Bigfoot, there's a tendency always to focus on like Seattle, Washington State, or with the Abominable Snowman, the Yeti, you talk about the Himalayas. China has the Yeren, Russia has the Almasty, Australia has the Yowie. But England, Scotland, Wales, combined, a very, very small nation, large population for a small island, 60 million people. So, you know, you would think, well, if Bigfoot's in Britain, where is it? That's the big question, if it's anywhere. And so one of the problems we have with Bigfoot in Britain is the size. The other one is the food issue. And then the third one is, why don't we ever catch one of these things? And so a lot of people such as myself, cryptozoologists, people investigate these things. We've got a lot of reports on file, and if you go back and you look at, for example, the files of cryptozoologists throughout the country, last 30, 40, 50 years, a lot of people have got, I suppose, fragments of stories which they filed away simply because they were sort of perceived as being too weird or strange, or the details just simply were lacking. But they were always along the lines of somebody saying, I was driving home late at night, saw this strange shaggy creature run out into the road, looked very human-like but tall, covered in dark hair, and had no idea what it was. Can you tell me? And of course it fits the classic image of the Bigfoot over here. And because these reports were so weird for a country like Britain, very, very few people within the cryptozoological community in England or Scotland or Wales had actually delved into these stories to any great extent. In fact, the most famous case in Britain, which originated in 1879, involved a creature called the man monkey, which was the subject of a book that I wrote. And this was probably the most in-depth research case for its time, and that's now 130 years ago. So it shows that in that period there really wasn't that much work done on the subject. Beyond people saying, wow, you know, this is really weird, and just filing it away for another day. And the man monkey was kind of, I guess, advantageous for me, because where this incident occurred was actually only about 15 to 20 miles from where I grew up in England. So it was actually quite easy to investigate the case. And what I did was to go back to the original notes and reports of the woman who wrote a book about it she wrote a book called Shropshire Folklore, which included this particular story. And the story was that late one night in 1879, in January, a man was walking back home, been delivering some furniture for a friend. He got a horse and cart with him, and he was passing this bridge. Now, bridges are something that feature in a lot of folklore, tales, mythology, all across the world and all across the board in terms of subject matter, whether it's ghosts, demons, cryptozoology, UFOs. Bridges, crossroads, waterways such as rivers, lakes, streams, anything like that seem to have odd legends attached to them. And certainly this one was no exception. And so what I did was to go back to the original source, this book called Shropshire Folklore by Charlotte Byrne, and read the account really to see if there was anything further I could find out about this particular story. And the story was, as I said, this guy was going across the bridge with his horse and cart and said that suddenly this strange creature leapt out of the bushes. And he described it, we can go on to the next image please, kind of looking something like that. And that's a picture done by a friend of mine who lives in Wales named Simon Wyatt. And as you can see, it's like a hairy, upright, man-like, ape-like creature with red eyes. Now, Lauren mentioned earlier about how it's pretty much a misconception that the Mothman has these self-illuminating, glowing red eyes. But in the British Bigfoot reports, a lot of them, the witnesses do talk about these creatures having these illuminated eyes. Now, what that means in terms of why that should be the case, we just don't know. It could be significant of something, it could be significant of nothing at all. But certainly the chief witness in the man-monkey case in 1879 said the creature had these bright glowing eyes, and supposedly, we just go back to the previous one, the creature jumped onto the cart that he was pulling. As you can see from the artist's rendition, it's kind of stood on top of it, and the guy's on the floor cowering in fear, which is pretty much how the story went. And he ran off the bridge, pulled the cart and horse behind him, and said that the creature just literally vanished in the blink of an eye. It didn't bound away. 1 second there, it was there, and another second it was gone. So, there's several weird aspects to it. The fact that people were even seeing these things in Britain, the fact that it had these weird eyes, and then I guess the strangest thing of all, the way in which it disappeared, literally like that. Being British and not really knowing what to do, he raced to the nearest town or little village and went into the pub and told everybody what happened. And the story and the legend kind of developed from there. And locally, at least, it became, I guess, sort of like a local story, to scare the kids, or go to bed early, or the man monkey will come and get you, that sort of thing. And but of course, at that particular time, 1879, there weren't any TVs, radios, no internet. So the story very much stayed localised. It didn't really get spread around Britain as a whole, even with Charlotte Byrne's book when that was published. And it was one of these stories that then really sort of died away and wasn't resurrected until around about the early 1980s, when a couple in England, Janet and Colin Board, who have written a lot of books on mysteries and the paranormal, UFOs, ghosts, historical mysteries. They resurrected the story for a book they wrote called Alien Animals. And I bought Alien Animals when I was about 20, something like that. And it got me interested because I thought, wow, this is not actually far from where I grew up. And so it was the ideal place to sort of go and investigate one of the first incidents that I actually got involved in terms of researching cryptozoology and understanding what the subject was and how you had to apply yourself to looking into these things. And if we can go back onto the next one, there you go. And one of the things I did as time progressed was to meet up with the Centre for Fortean Zoology, which is an organisation based in Devonshire, England, which is run by a friend of mine named John Downs. And the centre, I run the US office, and that's the emblem of the American office. And basically, the Centre for Fortean Zoology investigates weird creatures in simplistic terms. Whether it's like that Lauren was talking about earlier, creatures that are still being found, Creatures also that science has believed to become extinct, that maybe have survived extinction, like the coelacanth, and then other creatures that science simply denies exist, such as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. So I guess we kind of try and investigate anything that really sort of falls into the area of strange animals, weird creatures. And if we can go on to the next one, please. Now, contrary to popular opinion, that's not the British Bigfoot. That's actually John. And John's run the Centre for Fortean Zoology since the mid-1990s when he established it. And we've done a lot of overseas expeditions, been to Puerto Rico with John looking for the chupacabras. Richard, who's the in-house zoologist with the centre, recently came back from Russia where he was looking for the Russian wild man, or Bigfoot, however you want to term it. So we try and get around and do on-site investigations where possible. And with John and Richard, I did several expeditions and trips around Britain looking into these British Bigfoot reports. And next one. Now, that's the man-monkey bridge as it's become known on the Shropshire Union Canal. Now, when you talk about canals, particularly in Britain, there's this tendency to think of them as just like an open body of water with flattened ground either side and very, very open to the general public. The Shropshire Union Canal is actually very, very different because, as you can see, the roadway, the bridge at the top, is actually about 60 to 70 feet above the canal. And the entire length of this stretch of the canal, which is about 20 miles, is just surrounded on each side by thick woods, thick forests. And it's sort of a very, very spooky location where, a lot of people don't even go there because it has a lot of superstitions and legends attached to it concerning ghosts. There's a story about an American pilot in the Second World War whose plane was supposedly shot down by the Germans, and his ghost is still seen on the canal to this day. There's stories of a banshee-like creature also seen in this particular area, but the dominating one is the man-monkey. And that's the stretch of bridge at the top where the guy was walking with his horse and cart and said he saw this strange creature jump out at him and lunge on top of the horse, etc., etc. And so I've probably been out there now sort of 10 or 15 times and walked the length of the canal. And you can go on to the next one. That's the canal itself. As you can see, it's overshadowed on all sides by trees. Very spooky place, particularly when the sun goes down. The little towns and villages in the area actually haven't changed in many respects for hundreds of years. So it's kind of like taking a trip back in time, quite literally. And on this particular stretch of canal, the guy supposedly in a panic first ran down to the bank, then ran back up because he'd forgot he'd got his horse and cart up there, and then shot off to the nearest village. And the next one. That's the roadway itself on top, how it looks today. At the time, it was very much sort of gravelled and muddy, we presume, and just used by the typical horses and carts of the time. So what I did when I first began to look into these cases this particular case of the man-monkey, I was working as a journalist for an English newspaper called the Chase Post, and I wrote an article about the incidents and said, if anybody knows anything about this case, can you, if you're willing to come forward, tell me your stories. And what I actually thought would happen would that there might be someone who said, if I was really lucky, hey, my grandfather or great-grandfather was the person who was on the bridge and he told us and it went through the generations. That actually never happened, but what did happen was that 6 or 7 people initially, and over time more, came forward to say, well, I actually didn't know about that original case, but I saw a strange creature on the bridge or on the canal maybe 20 years before or 30 years ago or back in the 40s in one case. And so the realisation kind of hit home to me that although the initial sighting, which had been reported at the time and was in the books, and I think it was actually published in one of the local newspapers even back in 1879, although that had been forgotten about, people were still seeing this creature years and years later but hadn't reported it for fear of ridicule, what their friends would say, what their family would say, what their boss at work would say. And so they just kept it to themselves. And it was only when I published a story in the local newspaper that they realised, hey, I wasn't actually the first one to see it, I'm not crazy. and the people then started to come forward. And I got a good wide range of cases given to me. One of the most interesting ones came from a guy named Simon Ashpole, who was actually walking along the canal one day in the summer of 1982. And he was a bird watcher. He was out there actually taking photographs. There's a lot of, as you can probably guess from the previous pictures, there's a lot of wildlife in the area. And he was out there with his camera trying to capture pictures of birds, etc. And he said that he suddenly heard this strange noise coming from the other side of the canal, kind of like a grunting, rapid grunting noise. And he looked over, and he actually thought at first it was going to be something like a wild boar, like a wild pig. But he said this ape-like creature sort of rose up from the undergrowth. Now, he described it as not being like the muscular, big creature that I showed in the first picture with the glowing red eyes. He said it was more like about a 5 foot tall, like a large chimpanzee was the way he described it. And I think in some respects it's sort of similar to the way people have described the so-called skunk ape in Florida. You know, not this huge, massive, barrel-chested creature that is more commonly associated with Bigfoot, but something more smaller, lithe, thinner. And that was the way he described it. And he said it kind of glared at him and then just vanished into the trees. Now, just down the road from that particular bridge is a village called Ranton. And again, this is a very old village that hasn't even changed probably for nearly 200 years. And I think in something like 1785, the census count, there was 435 people living there. And I think today there's something like 535 people living there. So it's not really changed at all. A lot of the buildings that were there back then are still the same buildings. And I got to speak with a man who, in the Second World War, he heard a story about a creature that was seen coming from the vicinity of the canal towards Ranton, that one of the locals described as looking like a bear, but walking on its back feet. Now, of course, bears can stand up and walk on the back feet, but predominantly they walk on all fours. But that's how it was described, as like a large bear. Now, of course, there aren't any bears in Britain at all, or there shouldn't be, running wild. The bear became extinct centuries ago in Britain. But he described seeing this thing, as I said, like an upright bear. Another report that was given to me came from a guy in the early 1970s who was a truck driver, and he was driving across that previous stretch of bridge, and as he said, as he went round the bend, he saw this creature just charge across the road into the bushes. And of course, again, he'd never seen anything like this in his life, as certainly hardly anybody in Britain at all. Now, this was just at the tip of the iceberg. As time went on, more and more reports surfaced, but the thing I found strangest was that several of the witnesses talked about one characteristic of the cases that the original witness in 1879 talked about, was the fact that this creature, or creatures if it was more than one, seemed to just vanish in the blink of an eye. Now, I'm sure as Lauren knows, there's a lot we agree on, and there's some things we don't necessarily disagree on, but have different interpretations on. And one is, this issue of the British Bigfoot, at least, is it a physical flesh and blood animal, or is it something that's sort of far stranger? And I actually agree with Lauren when you talk about things like the paranormal or ultra-terrestrials and things like that, it's difficult to understand what that term means without actually having a scientific understanding or a way of explaining it. But all I can kind of tell you is that in a lot of these British Bigfoot reports, we do have strange aspects to them of these creatures vanishing and appearing. For example, one of the man-monkey cases, the person said that before they actually saw it, they were driving on that same stretch of bridge. As they got towards the bend in the road, their car engine and headlights failed, and then the creature came out from the side of the road. Now, in the UFO subjects, so-called vehicle interference cases, as they're known, are quite common, where someone's driving along, the headlights go out, the car engine cuts out, and this UFO looms into view. We either have to say it was just coincidence that the creature was seen at the same time that the car engine failed, or is something weirder going on. This is the big debate about the British Bigfoot, that we do have these strange aspects to it. And I think for me, the most bizarre story of all came from a guy who was out at the canal in 1976, and he was fishing there on 2 subsequent weekends. Now, on the first weekend, he said he saw this creature, again like a classic man monkey as it became known, on the other side of the bank, glaring at him in the same fashion that the guy in 1982 had done. And the following weekend he was out there again and said he saw this weird eel-like creature on the same stretch of water in the canal. And that's, as I said, one of the odd things about this particular stretch of water is that I guess in some respects, like the so-called Bridgewater Triangle issue, the whole area is a beacon for weird activity. And the village I mentioned, Ranton, in 1954, was the site of a very famous UFO encounter involving a woman named Jessica Rustenberg, who said she saw this classic flying saucer type thing hover over the farmhouse in which she was living. And there have been Black Panther, or so-called Black Panther, as in simple terms they're known, having been seen in the area. And one of the neighbouring villages called Woods Eaves actually has a legend attached to it of a so-called spectral black dog. Now, black dogs in England are sort of have a long history, a long folklore attached to them. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the Sherlock Holmes novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Well, that novel was actually based on existing rumours and tales and legends of these ghostly black hellhounds, as they became known, with glowing eyes, that were seen across the British Isles. And in many respects, they were sort of perceived as being, I guess, like a precursor to doom. If you see one of these things, someone in the family is going to die, or something along those lines. But again, it's sort of intriguing that we get these reports of these giant black dogs in the same place where people are seeing this monkey-like creature, this eel-like creature snaking through the canal, ghosts, etc., etc. So what I did was to compile all the stories together into the book of the man monkey. And I would say now there's probably somewhere in the region of 20 to 25 witness accounts that span. The earliest one I found obviously was third hand or second hand, which dated from 1845, and it had been passed through the generations of a family. So the original encounter or we thought was the original encounter at the bridge in 1879 may not actually have been the very first one. It could have been the second. There could have been others that were simply never reported or told to the families. But from the 1940s onwards, that's when the bulk of the reports have surfaced. And as I said, most people just simply didn't talk about these encounters because they just perceived them as being too strange to tell anybody about. But when these stories began to come in, and I said to the witnesses, is it okay to publish the details? They said yes. Then further reports of British Bigfoot type reports began to surface.